From the cozy villages of the Shire to the dark depths of Moria, Middle-earth is filled with places that possess rich history, fascinating lore, and unforgettable stories. Hello everyone, my name is Peter, and welcome to this new series, where we will explore the many places of Middle-earth. Together we will travel from its most famous cities and fortresses to its smallest and most forgotten villages, discovering their history, geography, and the people who call them home. For our first episode, I wanted to begin with one of my personal favorite places, the Breeland. The Breeland is a small region in Eriador situated between the Midgewater marshes, the Southern Downs, and the Barrow Downs. Although it measures only about 25 miles across, it occupies one of the most strategically important locations in northwestern Middle-earth. Two ancient roads run across and intersect in the region. The Great East Road runs west towards the Shire and east into the lands that were once part of Kingdom of Arnor before disappearing into the wild lone lands. Crossing it from north to the south is the Greenway, an ancient highway that once connected the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. Near the eastern boundary of the Breeland stands the Forsaken Inn, the final refuge for travelers before they enter the lonely and dangerous wilderness beyond. For anyone journeying east from the Shire, Bree was quite literally the last outpost of civilization. And that is perhaps the best way to describe the Breeland, an island of safety surrounded by a sea of wilderness. While kingdoms rose and fell and entire civilizations disappeared, Bree endured, preserving a peaceful way of life. The Breeland is centered around Bree Hill, the most prominent feature of the region, and the landmark from which much of the surrounding landscape takes its character. The countryside consists of gentle, rolling hills, open pastures, cultivated fields, and scattered woodlands. To the north lies the Chetwood, a dense forest that plays an important role during the events of The Lord of the Rings. To the east stretches a deep valley, while the southern slopes of Bree Hill are famous for the cultivation of pipeweed. Although Tolkien never explicitly describes the climate of the Breeland, it was likely mild and temperate, influenced by the warm and moist winds blowing inland from the Western Sea. The fertile soil and relatively peaceful surroundings allowed its inhabitants to prosper for centuries. The Breeland contains 4 settlements: Bree, Archet, Combe, and Staddle. Tolkien originally planned a 5th village called Crick, but it never appeared in the published version of the story. Among these settlements, by far the most important is the large village or small town of Bree. Bree holds a unique place in Middle-earth. It is the westernmost permanent settlement of man, and one of the very few places where different races live peacefully side by side. Along with its human population, many hobbits also call the village home, creating a society unlike any other in Tolkien's world. The village was built beneath and upon the western slopes of Bree Hill. It was protected by a deep ditch and a thick hedge that formed more than half a circle around the settlement before reconnecting with the hill itself. The Great East Road entered the village through the west gate, curved around the foot of Bree Hill, and exited through the south gate before continuing eastward. After nightfall, both gates were closed and guarded by gatekeepers, who lived in small lodges beside them. Bree itself consisted of roughly 100 stone houses, occupied primarily by men. Above these houses, the slopes of the Bree Hill were dotted with hobbit halls where much of the hobbit population lived. The name Bree itself comes from an old Celtic word meaning hill, an appropriate name for a settlement built around the most prominent hill in the region. Of course, no discussion of Bree would be complete without mentioning its most famous landmark, the Prancing Pony. The inn had stood for longer than anyone could remember and served as a meeting place for travelers from across Eriador. Rangers, dwarves, merchants, wandering hobbits, and the occasional mysterious stranger all passed through its doors. By the end of the Third Age, it would become one of the most important locations in the entire story of The Lord of the Rings. We will explore the Prancing Pony in an episode of its own. Northeast of Bree lies the small village of Archet, located near the southern edge of the Chetwood. Unlike Bree, Archet is surrounded by trees and feels considerably more isolated from the outside world. Its population consists mostly of men, although a number of hobbits also live here. The village's name has Celtic origins. Tolkien himself explained that it is derived from an ancient British root related to woodland, while the Welsh word Argoed means trees or the edge of a forest. The name therefore perfectly matches the settlement's location on the border of the Chetwood. Although Archet plays only a minor role in the books, it has become well known among fans through the Lord of the Rings Online, where it serves as one of the starting locations for human characters. Another settlement of the Breeland is Combe, situated northeast of Bree and north of the Great East Road. Unlike Bree or Staddle, Combe lies within a deep valley, giving it a more secluded character. Its name is also derived from English geography. The word Combe refers to a deep, usually narrow valley and appears in many real-world place names through Britain. Once again, Tolkien chose a name that accurately reflects the landscape. The final settlement is Staddle, located on the gentle southern slopes of the Bree Hill. Among the four villages, Staddle was the principal settlement of the Bree hobbits, and the surrounding hillsides were famous for producing pipeweed. Its name comes from Old English, and like many of Tolkien's place names, it's rooted in genuine English linguistic history. Together, the four villages formed a small but stable community, and while the great kingdoms of Middle-earth collapsed around them, these villages quietly endured, preserving a simple way of life that had existed for centuries. Unlike almost every other region of Middle-earth, Bree is home to both men and hobbits, who have lived peacefully alongside one another for centuries. The two communities refer to each other as the Big Folk and the Little Folk, a simple expression that perfectly captures the friendly nature of their relationship. The origins of the Men of Bree remain somewhat mysterious. Tolkien tells us that they were descendants of ancient people who had lived in Eriador long before the arrival of the Númenóreans, and were probably related to the ancestors of the Dunlendings. While kingdoms rose and fell around them, the Bree folk remained where they had always lived. Physically, these men were generally described as short and broad, often with brown hair. More importantly, they were cheerful, practical, and rather provincial. Unlike many other men in Middle-earth, however, they maintained friendly relations with hobbits, dwarfs, and even the occasional elf passing through their land. Around the year 1300 of the Third Age, a new people arrived in the region. The hobbits, fleeing the growing dangers in the east, migrated westward and settled in the Breeland. There, they established one of the most remarkable societies in Tolkien's legendarium, where men and hobbits lived together while maintaining their own traditions and customs. The Bree folk even followed their own version of the calendar, known as the Bree calendar, which was essentially a local adaptation of the King's Reckoning. Their dialect of Westron also reflected their isolated way of life. Tolkien remarks that words such as history and geography were not commonly used among them, suggesting that the people of Bree had little interest in distant lands or ancient lore. Their concerns were local: farming, trade, family, and the everyday affairs of the community. One unique tradition shared by both men and hobbits of Bree was the habit of taking surnames for plants and nature. Families bore names such as Butterbur, Ferny, Goatleaf, Appledore, Russlight, and Thistlewool. These names give the Breeland a distinctly rural and English character, reinforcing Tolkien's inspiration from the countryside he loved. Although Bree appears only briefly in The Lord of the Rings, several memorable characters come from the region. Perhaps the most famous is Ballyman Butterbur, the owner of the Prancing Pony. Good-hearted, hard-working, and constantly overwhelmed by his responsibilities, Butterbur is one of Tolkien's most interesting minor characters. His forgetfulness nearly proves disastrous when he neglects to send Gandalf's letter to Frodo, yet his kindness and hospitality leave a lasting impression. Another important figure is Harry Goatleaf, the gatekeeper of Bree. At first he appears to be little more than a cautious local, but he is later revealed to have spoken with the Nazgul and eventually falls in with Saruman's ruffians during the troubled days that follow. In the movies, Harry is the guy who is crushed by the gate when the Nazguls break down the gates of Bree. There is also Bill Ferny, one of the least pleasant inhabitants of Bree. Sneering and dishonest, he acts as an informant for the Black Riders and later joins the ruffians who terrorize both Bree and the Shire. The Prancing Pony is also home to two hobbit servants, Nob and Bob, whose small but memorable role contributes to the inn's welcoming atmosphere. Finally, there is perhaps the most beloved resident of all, Bill the Pony, purchased by the company in Bree after their own ponies are stolen. Bill proves to be one of the most loyal companions of the Fellowship and survives hardships that would have broken many stronger creatures. Bree seems to have been famous to Eriador for its sayings and expressions. In fact, Tolkien gives it more recognizable proverbs than almost any other place in the Lord of the Rings. One of the best known is "strange as news from Bree." Among the people of the Shire, this expression meant that something was extremely unusual or unexpected. The Bree-land is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions in Middle-earth. Tolkien indicates that its people have lived there since at least the middle of the Second Age, making the settlements older than many of the kingdoms that later surrounded them. Remarkably, Bree survived some of the greatest upheavals in the history of Middle-earth. It witnessed the downfall of Númenor, the rise of Arnor, the division of Arnor, then the war against Angmar, and finally the complete collapse of Arnor itself. Through all these events, the villages of the Breeland endured. By the end of the Third Age, they stood almost alone as an island of civilization between the Shire and Rivendell. The people of Bree rarely involved themselves in the great affairs of the wider world. To them, the concerns of kings, wars, and distant lands mattered little compared to the harvest or the latest gossip from the neighboring villages. Ironically, their peaceful existence was only possible because others protected them. For generations, the Rangers of the North secretly guarded the roads and countryside, driving away evil creatures and keeping watch over the remnants of Arnor. Yet, the Bree folk largely failed to appreciate their efforts. Many regarded the Rangers with suspicion and referred to them simply as mysterious wanderers. Without realizing it, they owed much of their safety to these silent guardians. For centuries, this quiet way of life continued. Peace, however, would come to an end in the autumn of the year 3018 of the Third Age. By the year 3018, Sauron had regained much of his strength, and war was spreading across the east and south. Although the people of Bree remained largely unaware of these events, subtle signs began to appear. More and more travelers arrived from the south, including strange-looking men moving north along the Greenway. Since the ancient road connecting Arnor and Gondor had seen little traffic for centuries, this sudden increase caused concern. Dwarfs passing through Bree also brought increasingly grim news from distant lands. Even more worrying, the Rangers became rare visitors to the pony, and Gandalf the Grey, who had often passed through Bree over the years, had not been seen for some time. Then, during the final days of September, the danger that had long remained beyond Bree's border finally arrived at its gates. Two of the Nazgul appeared at the west gate and questioned the gatekeeper, Harry Goatleaf. They asked about hobbits from the Shire. Their presence terrified the local people, yet few could imagine the true significance of what they had witnessed. The peaceful world of Bree was about to become part of the greatest story in the history of Middle-earth. On the 29th of September, 4 Shire hobbits arrived to the gates of Bree. Their destination was the Prancing Pony, where Gandalf had intended to meet them. Unknown to Frodo and his companions, however, the servants of Sauron had already reached the town. Several of the Nazgul were nearby, where their local agents, including Bill Ferny and the mysterious Southerner, carefully observed the newcomers and reported their movements to the Black Riders. The ring had come to Bree, and the hunt was closing in. That evening, Frodo accidentally attracted unwanted attention inside the Prancing Pony. A weather-beaten ranger, known only as Strider, approached Frodo and warned him that he was in grave danger. Although the hobbits were naturally suspicious, they eventually agreed to trust him, a decision that would ultimately save their lives. During the night of the 30th of September, servants of the Nazgul attacked the hobbits' rooms at the Prancing Pony, believing that Frodo and his companions were asleep inside. In reality, Strider had persuaded them to spend the night elsewhere within the inn. The attackers slashed the beds to pieces, but found only blankets and pillows. At the same time, the hobbits' ponies were driven away, forcing the company to delay their departure while new animals were obtained. As they finally prepared to leave Bree around midday, one last memorable incident took place. Bill Ferny sat on a fence outside the town, mocking the travelers and wishing them an unpleasant journey. Sam, already thoroughly disgusted with the man, picked up an apple and threw it with remarkable accuracy, striking Bill on the nose. Leaving the road behind, Aragorn led the hobbits into the Chetwood in an attempt to shake off any pursuers before continuing towards Weathertop. Later that evening, Gandalf finally arrived at the pony. He spent the night there, unaware that even greater danger was approaching. Before dawn on October the 1st, the Witch King himself arrived at Bree, accompanied by 4 other Nazgul. Realizing that the ring-bearer had escaped, they rode directly through the town, smashing the gates and spreading terror among the inhabitants. Horses panicked, doors were barred, and the people of Bree awoke to scenes unlike anything they had ever witnessed. For a community that had known centuries of relative peace, the arrival of the Black Riders was a nightmare. Gandalf confronted the Nazgul and pursued them, but Frodo and his companions were already far beyond Bree, beginning the next stage of their perilous journey. After these events, Bree largely disappears from the narrative until the end of the War of the Ring. When Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin finally return home, they once again stop at the pony. They are immediately surprised by how different the town has become. The gates are heavily guarded, strangers are viewed with suspicion, and the once carefree atmosphere has disappeared. Inside the inn, they are warmly welcomed by Ballyman, though he is now armed and clearly worried about the state of the region. Through him, the hobbits learn what has happened during their absence. Following their departure, increasing numbers of suspicious travelers and ruffians had entered the Breeland from the south. The local people eventually drove many of them away, but they simply settled in the nearby woods alongside Bill Ferny and Harry Goatleaf. From there, they began attacking travelers and raiding the countryside. During the winter of 3018, they became bold enough to assault Bree itself. 3 men and 2 hobbits were killed before the attackers were finally driven off. Some of the ruffians fled into the woods beyond Archet and survived as robbers, while others, including Bill Ferny, continued into the Shire, where they joined Saruman's forces during the scouring of the Shire. One of the most touching conversations in the entire chapter occurs when the hobbits tell Ballyman that there is once again a king in the north who will soon restore peace to the roads. At first, he doubts that any king would concern himself with a small place like Bree. Then he discovers that the new king is none other than Strider, the quiet ranger he had known for years. His surprise quickly turns into hope. The next morning, the hobbits continue their journey home. Tolkien tells us little about Bree during the Fourth Age. Nevertheless, it is reasonable to assume that with King Elasar restoring order through Arnor and traffic once again flowing along the ancient roads, Bree entered a new period of peace and prosperity. Bree appears in both Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit film trilogies, although we see relatively little of the settlement itself. The film's primary focus is on the Prancing Pony and portray Bree as a muddy frontier town filled with suspicious strangers and dark alleyways. While this atmosphere certainly fits the story, it only captures one aspect of Tolkien's Bree. In the books, it is also a comfortable and welcoming community where ordinary people live quiet lives far removed from the great struggles of the world. For me, the finest representation of the Bree-land is found in The Lord of the Rings Online. In that game, Archet serves as one of the starting areas for human characters, and players can freely explore Bree, Combe, Staddle, Chetwood, and the surrounding countryside. Bree itself functions as one of the major hubs of the game and feels alive with travelers, merchants, and adventurers. It was this version of the Bree-land that first made me fall in love with the region. And no, this video is not sponsored. I simply think every Tolkien fan should give the game a try, especially since it's free to play on Steam. The Bree-land might not be the most spectacular region of Middle-earth. No great battles were fought here, no magnificent cities were built, and no legendary kings ruled from its hills. Yet, that is precisely what makes it special. It is a place where ordinary people live ordinary lives in an extraordinary world. It is one of the few corners of Middle-earth where men and hobbits coexist peacefully, where a weary traveler can still hope to find a warm meal and a good pint at the local inn, and where kindness often proves just as important as heroism. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments, would you choose to live in Bree?